bear with me as I introduce you to this book, Harold Lamb's The March of the Barbarians. Of course, I don't mean anything to say that, if somebody is not Christian or if they don't speak some particular European language, that they are, we should just call them barbarians, or we should say that they're not civilized because they're not part of our civilization group. But we have, we got the route of those that they call barbarians. We got the Silk Road, and we got the route of the Pilgrims. Now, where, the origins of civilization probably occur right around there, in the Afghanistan area about 40,000 years ago, not closer to the sea in Mesopotamia. But so see, 1940, so it's been 80 years, so sharing this is just fine. One will be the steppes of Asia. And so let's show you the table of contents before we get started here. I'm not sure how good of... They lived along the fringe of the great ice. We know them only as shadowy groups of families hunting their meat below the edge of the glacial ice under the flaring northern lights. At this time, when snow still covered the higher ranges of Asia and the last of the salt seas were drying up in the heart of Asia, these men were cut off from the sun-warmed regions of the south. In that south, as millenniums passed, civilization began to be. It appeared in the river valleys where human beings could cultivate the fertile soil. It advanced when different races came into contact by making war on each other, or by the intercourse of trade, usually by social interaction, but the natural, expansive exploration of humanity in particular. When one race mixed with another, a spark was kindled. New ideas came into being with children of new blood, from the Nile to the plain of the Tigris and the Euphrates, and to the river Indus. This belt of mother civilization extended. It reached across the Mediterranean to the sea dwellers of Crete. The inhabitants of this mother civilization gathered into cities in the centers of cultivated areas to protect themselves and their goods. They built walls around the cities, the clay brick walls of Kish, rising with the stonework of Mohenjo-Daro in India some 5,000 years ago. You might want to see the Ramayana for some of what relates to that. A little later, 1,000 years may signify many changes in the affairs of human beings, while they are no more than an episode in the implacable tendency of nature. Civilization appeared in the Far East, along the rivers, flowing into an ocean then unknown, the Pacific. Chinese legends relate that men who had wrapped their bodies in the skins of animals and had lived like animals, knowing their mothers but not their fathers, had advanced to civilization under the mythical Earth Emperors, Shun and Yu. These progressive men of China, it appears, rose to enlightenment by 4 steps: crops, matrimony, the calendar, and cooking. However that might have been, the Chinese became, like the sea dwellers of Ur and Babylon, cultivators of the soil, bound to the soil, and they thrived. Meanwhile, the forgotten men in North Asia, roving somewhere along the frozen tundras, had developed a peculiarity. They had horses. They still lived isolated from the civilized centers. They still hunted game and dressed themselves in skins. Sometimes they fished and wore fish skins to keep out the cold. They had domesticated the animals of this northern region, the reindeer, sheep, and wild horse. Animal meat and milk nourished them, and they began to work hair into felts to cover tent poles and shelter them. Of necessity, they wandered in search of game, and grazing for the domesticated animals, some of them kept to the virgin forest with their reindeer herds, building huts for shelter. The forest people, others living on horse herds, pushed down into the grasslands, sheltering themselves in felt tents. The steppe dwellers, their isolation kept them barbarians. Well, it sounds like all this made them rather civilized, but in their own way. Their wandering made them nomads, and their horses could carry them at speed over the steppes. The horse nomads had, at this time, a unique domain. It stretched from the Arctic ice with its frozen swamps, tundras, down to what they called the Great Snowy Mountains, Tibet, and the Himalayas. There's the oldest evidence of humans right now, by millions of years, was in that region, actually. And from, even the point of civilization, I mean, it seemed like they had symbolic use of designs. And from the river valleys of the Celestial Empire, China, through the spinal barrier heights of mid-Asia, on through a wilderness of grass valleys and forests to the far western barrier that the nomads called the Earth Girdle, the Urals. We know this immense domain vaguely as the steppes of Asia. It is also known as Central Asia and sometimes as High Asia because so much of it is elevated plateau land crossed by mountain ranges. Actually, it is as varied as the climatic changes which run from excessive cold to burning heat, and more often than not, sweeping winds. The cold tundras, where the only grazing for animals is moss lichen, yield to the vast Siberian forests cut by swift rivers whose water is sweet. Below these forests stretch the grasslands, the high prairies where little rain falls. Toward the west, mountain ranges thrust into these open steppes, and in the ranges, the barbarians came upon deposits of iron and silver, and some of the tribes learned to mine the deposits and work the metals after a fashion. Southward, below the prairies, with their rich grass, extends the arid area of the desert, the Gobi, with its baked clay and windswept sand. Around the edge of the Gobi lie a chain of lakes, some of them the salty beds of ancient seas. The growth here is the gray wraith of tamarisk and brittle thornbush, food for camels, not for cattle. Still, farther to the south, rises one of Earth's mightiest barriers, the Tibetan Plateau, flanked by the mountain ranges that are almost impenetrable, from Samarkand to the shore of the Gulf of Tonkin. Well, don't agree with it in a moralistic sense, but the Chinese conquering of Tibet is actually quite the military feat, despite its small... who's ever done that before? Except, Tibetan Buddhism. So the horse nomads dwelt in the steppes and deserts that offered them a complete contrast between the good earth of the prairies and the river valleys and the waste of the dry lands. Possession of the good land meant life, while exile into the barrens meant inevitable destruction. In consequence, the nomads of the steppes struggled for the fertile land. The victorious tribes survived, and the vanquished became their servants, or they perished. And, dwarfing these human wars, they waged an unceasing struggle with nature to endure. By such hardships, their bodies were shaped. As it happened, one of the most fertile regions lies southeast of Lake Baikal, where the prairies are moistened by the headwaters of rivers flowing into that isolated lake and into the great Amur River. This was a desirable region, a bone of contention among the nomad clans. Now, we now know that there's over 130-something variations of genetics that let you know skin color and texture. And There's other racial differences, and there's language differences, and these differences tend to indicate, not that one group's necessarily stronger or more intelligent by nature. It's, for their climate. And